A police officer, blinded by arrogance and racial bias, targets a black female doctor during a tense encounter, belittling her expertise and authority. What he doesn't realize is that his actions are about to ignite a chain of events that will expose his own corruption and shatter his sense of control. This isn't just a battle of wills, it's a fight for justice, and the officer has picked the wrong woman to underestimate. As the truth unravels, the consequences will be more explosive than he could have imagined. Don't miss the twists and revelations. Subscribe and like our channel for more gripping stories like this one. Dr. Maya Johnson, her exhaustion evident but her resolve unshaken, approached the group of officers. She focused on the young man they escorted, his injuries glaringly apparent. Without hesitation, she stepped in, her voice calm but firm, addressing the officer in charge, Tom Bradley. Tom turned sharply, his gaze landing on Maya. His expression shifted instantly to one of veiled disdain. He dismissed her presence, asserting that the suspect's injuries were minor and implying resistance during arrest was the cause. Maya's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure, insisting the man required immediate medical evaluation. The tension between them was immediate and electric. Tom, unwilling to yield control, stepped closer, lowering his voice but sharpening his tone. He questioned her authority in the situation, emphasizing his role as the law enforcer. Maya stood her ground, her tone unyielding as she reminded him that in medical matters, she was the authority. The young man swayed, his legs threatening to give way. Maya moved quickly, instructing nearby staff to bring a gurney. Her attention remained on the patient even as Tom's frustration mounted. He accused her of undermining his authority, but Maya's focus never wavered. Her voice was steady as she rebutted his claims, stating her duty was to save lives, not cater to egos. Behind Tom, Jane Miller observed the exchange with growing discomfort. She had seen Tom's temper flare before and recognized the danger of escalation. Summoning her courage, she intervened, suggesting that they allow Maya to proceed. Tom's jaw clenched, his authority challenged not just by the doctor but now by his own colleague. Maya, unfazed, directed the staff to wheel the young man away. She turned back to Tom briefly, her gaze firm and unrelenting. She reminded him once more that her responsibility was to her patient and that his actions risked compromising care. Without waiting for a response, she walked away, her confidence unshaken. Tom's fists clenched at his sides, his frustration simmering. Jane stepped closer to him, her tone low but pointed. She urged him to let it go, warning that his actions were drawing unnecessary attention. Tom barely acknowledged her, his focus fixed on Maya's retreating figure. In the quiet of the staff corridor, Maya exhaled deeply, her hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline. She retrieved her phone from her pocket and answered an incoming call, her voice steady as she recounted the confrontation. The words she spoke carried a mixture of frustration and determination, the weight of the encounter still heavy on her mind. Tom, meanwhile, stood near the entrance, his phone buzzing in his hand. He answered the call tersely, his tone clipped. The conversation was brief but left his expression darkened. He turned back toward the hospital, his resolve hardening. The clash with Maya was far from over, and both knew this was only the beginning. The echo of hurried footsteps filled the hospital hallway as Tom Bradley strode toward the staff area, his anger palpable. The confrontation with Dr. Maya Johnson replayed in his mind, her defiance cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. She had challenged him, stripped him of the control he relied upon, and now that encounter lingered like a wound he couldn't ignore. Inside the staff lounge, Maya stood near the counter, her phone in hand. She finished her call with the same composure she had displayed earlier, though her body betrayed the tension she carried. When the door swung open, she didn't flinch, but her posture shifted slightly, anticipating the storm brewing behind her. Tom entered the room, his broad frame dominating the space. He stopped just inside, fixing her with a look that carried all the frustration and resentment he'd bottled up since their encounter. Maya turned to face him, her expression calm but her eyes sharp, ready for whatever came next. His movements were deliberate as he stepped closer, his voice low and charged with suppressed anger. He demanded an explanation for what he perceived as a public undermining of his authority. Maya met his gaze, her response steady and precise, emphasizing her duty to prioritize the well-being of her patient. Each word she spoke only fueled the fire in him, her calmness grating against his need to reassert control. The room seemed to shrink as the tension between them grew. Tom's frustration boiled over into veiled accusations, his body language betraying the struggle to maintain his composure. Maya, unwavering, held her ground, her own emotions tightly controlled as she countered his every point with reason and clarity. It was a battle of wills, and neither was willing to back down. As the confrontation escalated, Tom's demeanor shifted. He paced the room, his movements erratic, searching for a way to regain the upper hand. He paused, his tone taking on a mockingly authoritative edge as he insinuated that Maya's actions had consequences. Maya's expression hardened, but she refused to rise to his bait. Her measured response cut through his posturing, exposing the emptiness of his threats. Their standoff was interrupted by the arrival of Jane Miller. She entered hesitantly, sensing the charged atmosphere. Her eyes moved between the two, taking in Tom's barely contained anger and Maya's poised defiance. Jane's unease grew as she recognized the potential for things to spiral further. Jane stepped forward, her presence breaking the intensity of the moment. Her intervention was calm but firm, redirecting Tom's attention to the matters awaiting them elsewhere. Reluctantly, he allowed himself to be led out of the room, though his frustration lingered in every step he took. Left alone, Maya exhaled slowly, the adrenaline from the encounter still coursing through her. She turned back to the counter, steadying herself before reaching for her phone. The confrontation had left her shaken, but it had also solidified her resolve. She typed out a quick message, her fingers moving with purpose, before slipping the phone back into her pocket. Outside, Tom climbed into the squad car, his grip on the steering wheel tight. Jane joined him, her expression a mix of concern and restraint. The silence between them was heavy, the tension from the hospital lingering like an unspoken weight. As they pulled away, Jane's unease deepened, but she kept her thoughts to herself. Inside the hospital, Maya watched the car disappear from the window above. Her expression was unreadable, but her mind raced with the implications of what had unfolded. She knew the confrontation wasn't over, and the weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. Still, a flicker of determination burned within her. This was only the beginning. Tom Bradley paced the dimly lit conference room, his mind churning with thoughts he couldn't suppress. The events at the hospital had struck a nerve he didn't know he had. Every word, every glance from Maya Johnson had been like a sharp blade against his sense of authority. His pride, bruised and throbbing, refused to let the confrontation fade. He wanted control back, needed to prove to himself and everyone else that he was the one in charge. The door creaked open behind him. Jane Miller stepped in, her movements hesitant but purposeful. She had been watching Tom closely since their departure from the hospital, sensing the storm brewing within him. Her instincts told her to intervene before his anger spilled into something irreversible. Tom turned sharply at the sound of the door, his eyes narrowing. Jane's presence was an unwelcome reminder of his perceived failure. She could see the tension radiating off him, his clenched fists and rigid posture a testament to his inner turmoil. Jane didn't flinch under his glare. She stepped closer, her voice steady as she pointed out the risks of escalating the situation further. She reminded him of the scrutiny they were already under after the hospital incident, emphasizing the need to de-escalate. But Tom wasn't listening. He waved off her concerns, his tone dismissive and laced with frustration. He moved toward the window, staring out into the night as though searching for answers in the darkness. His breathing was heavy, his mind racing with possibilities. He muttered about Maya, her defiance, her confidence, and how she had dared to challenge him in front of everyone. Jane watched him carefully, her own frustration simmering beneath the surface. She couldn't understand his obsession, but she knew it was dangerous. Meanwhile, in her quiet apartment, Maya Johnson sat at her desk, the events of the day replaying in her mind. She felt the weight of her decisions, the confrontation lingering in her thoughts like an uninvited guest. She'd faced pushback before, but Tom Bradley's aggression had been different. It was personal, charged with an intensity that left her uneasy. Her fingers tapped absently on the desk as she considered her next steps. She knew this wasn't over. Her phone buzzed, drawing her attention. It was a message from an unknown number. The words on the screen were vague but unsettling, a veiled warning cloaked in politeness. Maya stared at the message, her mind racing. She could feel the edges of something larger closing in, the shadow of an unseen threat stretching toward her. Taking a deep breath, she resolved to stay vigilant. She wouldn't let fear dictate her actions. Back at the precinct, Tom finally turned to face Jane, his expression grim. He accused her of siding with Maya, of not understanding the stakes. Jane's temper flared, and she pushed back, challenging him in a way she rarely dared. Her voice rose as she reminded him of their responsibility, of the oath they'd taken. She accused him of letting his pride cloud his judgment, of turning a professional matter into something deeply personal. Her words were a slap in the face, and Tom's reaction was immediate. He snapped, his anger boiling over as he shouted her down, his frustration erupting like a volcano. The tension between them reached a breaking point. Jane stormed out of the room, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and disappointment. She couldn't shake the feeling that something irreversible was happening, that Tom's fixation was dragging them both into dangerous territory. As the night deepened, Tom sat alone in the room, the silence pressing in around him. His phone buzzed on the table, breaking the stillness. He glanced at the screen, the caller ID unfamiliar. Against his better judgment, he answered. The voice on the other end was low and measured, the words carefully chosen. It was someone offering information about Maya, a piece of leverage he hadn't expected but couldn't resist. His grip on the phone tightened as he listened, his mind racing with the possibilities. The next morning, Maya arrived at the hospital early, her resolve unshaken despite the unease simmering beneath the surface. She moved through her rounds with efficiency, her focus on her patients a welcome distraction. But as the day progressed, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A fleeting glance here, a lingering look there, it was subtle, but it was enough to keep her on edge. Later that day, as she left the hospital, she noticed a car parked across the street. It was unmarked, but the figure inside was unmistakable. Tom Bradley sat behind the wheel, his gaze fixed on her as she stepped into the sunlight. Their eyes met briefly, and Maya's stomach tightened. She didn't look away, her chin lifting in silent defiance before she walked to her own car. Tom watched her drive away, his thoughts a tangle of frustration and determination. He didn't know why he couldn't let this go, why every interaction with her seemed to unearth something raw and unsettled within him. But he knew one thing for certain, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Maya sat at her desk, the weight of the previous days pressing on her like a physical force. The message from the unknown number lingered in her mind, its vague yet threatening tone gnawing at her focus. She tried to channel her thoughts into work, but her instincts told her something larger was unfolding, something she couldn't yet grasp. She wasn't one to back down, but the tension was beginning to take its toll. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her office door. She looked up to see Jane Miller standing there, her expression tight. Maya gestured for her to come in, noting the unease in the officer's posture. Jane hesitated before closing the door behind her. Her presence was unexpected, and Maya's curiosity was piqued. Jane took a moment to gather her thoughts before speaking, her voice low and measured. She mentioned that things at the precinct had become increasingly tense, particularly around Tom Bradley. She admitted that his behavior had been erratic, his fixation on Maya growing more concerning by the day. Jane's words carried a warning, though she stopped short of explicitly stating it. Maya listened intently, her mind racing as she pieced together what Jane wasn't saying. Before Maya could respond, the door burst open, and Tom strode in uninvited. His eyes flicked between the two women, suspicion and anger etched into his features. Jane stiffened, her composure faltering under Tom's piercing gaze. Maya's expression, however, remained steady, her body language calm but alert. Tom's voice was sharp as he demanded to know why Jane was there, his tone accusatory. Jane stammered out an explanation, but Tom cut her off, his frustration boiling over. He turned his attention to Maya, his words laced with thinly veiled threats. He accused her of undermining him, of stepping out of line, and warned her to tread carefully. Maya's response was deliberate and measured, her voice steady as she countered his accusations with facts. The tension in the room was suffocating. Jane, caught between loyalty and conscience, struggled to find her footing. Tom's anger grew with each passing second, his frustration manifesting in his body language. Maya's calm demeanor only seemed to fuel his rage, her refusal to show fear a direct challenge to his authority. Suddenly, the sound of a phone vibrating broke the standoff. Maya glanced at her desk, where her phone lit up with another message from the unknown number. She picked it up, her eyes scanning the screen. The message was short but chilling, referencing the current confrontation as though the sender was watching. Maya's stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. Tom noticed her reaction and demanded to see the phone. Maya refused, her voice firm. The standoff escalated as Tom reached for the phone, his anger spilling over into action. Maya stood her ground, her voice rising as she called out his behavior, the sharpness of her tone cutting through the air like a blade. Jane stepped between them, her voice trembling as she urged Tom to back off. The room crackled with tension as the three stood frozen in place, the power dynamics shifting with every heartbeat. Maya's defiance had forced Tom into a corner, his authority slipping away with each passing moment. Jane's presence added another layer of complexity, her loyalty to Tom clashing with her growing respect for Maya. Tom finally stepped back, his face a mask of frustration and humiliation. He turned and stormed out of the office, the door slamming behind him. Jane let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly. Maya placed the phone on her desk, her expression unreadable. The weight of the confrontation hung in the air, the echoes of their words lingering long after the door had closed. Jane looked at Maya, her eyes filled with a mix of apology and admiration. She admitted that things had gone too far, that Tom's behavior was becoming a liability. Maya nodded, her mind already working through the implications of what had just happened. She thanked Jane for her honesty, her tone sincere. The moment was interrupted by another buzz from Maya's phone. This time, the message was different. It included an address and a time, with a cryptic note that suggested answers to her growing questions could be found there. Maya's brow furrowed as she considered the risks. Jane noticed the change in her expression and asked what was wrong. Maya hesitated, then decided to share the message. Jane's face darkened as she read it, her instincts immediately on high alert. Maya knew she had to follow the lead, but she also understood the danger. She asked Jane if she would accompany her, recognizing the value of having someone she could cautiously trust. Jane agreed, her own sense of duty driving her decision. The two women left the office together, their shared determination setting the stage for the next chapter of their unfolding story. As they drove toward the address, the tension in the car was palpable. Maya's mind raced with possibilities, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. Jane kept her eyes on the road, her jaw set as she prepared for whatever lay ahead. Neither spoke, the silence heavy with unspoken thoughts. The car pulled up to an unassuming building, its exterior giving no indication of what lay inside. Maya and Jane exchanged a look before stepping out, their movements deliberate and cautious. They approached the door, Maya's hand trembling slightly as she reached for the handle. With a deep breath, she pushed it open, the darkness inside swallowing them whole. Maya and Jane stepped cautiously into the dimly lit room. The heavy silence inside was a stark contrast to the pounding of their hearts. Maya's breath hitched as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, taking in the scattered papers and flickering screens that illuminated the space with a cold glow. Jane's hand instinctively moved to her side, her fingers brushing against her holstered weapon. There was no immediate danger, but the air was thick with the promise of something ominous. The sound of a chair scraping against the floor broke the silence. Both women turned sharply, their bodies tense and ready. A man emerged from the shadows, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat. His movements were deliberate as he approached, each step echoing in the stillness. Maya's eyes narrowed, her instincts warning her that this encounter would change everything. The man introduced himself with a tone that carried authority and weariness. He revealed that he had been following the threads of corruption that linked the precinct, the hospital, and other entities in the city. His words were measured, each one landing like a weight on Maya's shoulders. He spoke of hidden agendas, of people in power manipulating events for their own gain. As he spoke, he reached for a folder on the table, sliding it toward Maya. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The first thing she saw was a photo of Tom Bradley, his face stern and imposing. Beneath it were pages of documents, detailing transactions, emails, and recorded conversations that painted a damning picture. Maya's heart sank as she realized the depth of the corruption. Jane, standing beside her, leaned in to look, her face hardening with each piece of evidence. The man's voice continued, his words cutting through the weight of what they were seeing. He explained that Tom wasn't acting alone, that he was a pawn in a much larger game. Maya's mind raced, connecting the dots between the threats she had received, Tom's erratic behavior, and the escalating tension in her life. She felt a mix of anger and determination rising within her. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing the truth and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Jane's voice broke through Maya's thoughts. Her tone was firm as she questioned the man, demanding to know why he was sharing this now and what he wanted from them. The man's expression softened slightly, and he admitted that he couldn't fight this battle alone. He needed people on the inside, people with integrity and courage. His eyes lingered on Maya, silently asking if she was ready to step into a fight that could consume her. Maya's response was unspoken, her resolve clear in the way she straightened her posture and met his gaze. Jane, however, remained guarded. She couldn't ignore the danger this posed, not just to them but to everyone around them. Her loyalty to the badge and her growing respect for Maya clashed within her, creating a storm of emotions she struggled to contain. The tension in the room shifted as the man handed them a USB drive. He explained that it contained the linchpin of the operation, a series of files that would expose not only Tom but also the higher-ups who were pulling the strings. He warned them that once the information was revealed, there would be no turning back. They would become targets, just as he had. Before they could respond, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the moment. Jane's hand immediately went to her weapon, her body tensing as she moved toward the door. Maya followed, her heart pounding as adrenaline surged through her veins. The man remained calm, motioning for them to stay low as he peered out the window. His expression darkened as he confirmed their fears. They had been followed. The door burst open, and 3 men stormed in, their movements calculated and aggressive. Jane reacted instantly, drawing her weapon and barking orders. Maya backed toward the table, clutching the USB drive tightly. The intruders ignored Jane's warnings, advancing with a predatory confidence. The room erupted into chaos as Jane fired a warning shot, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Maya's mind raced as she looked for an escape. The man who had brought them here moved swiftly, his experience evident as he engaged one of the intruders in a struggle. Jane managed to disarm another, her movements precise and controlled. Maya's eyes darted to the folder on the table, the evidence scattered across its surface. She knew they couldn't leave it behind. Summoning her courage, Maya lunged for the papers, gathering them as quickly as she could. One of the intruders noticed her and moved toward her, his intent clear. Jane intercepted him, her body a blur of motion as she fought to protect Maya. The tension in the room was suffocating, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, the man who had brought them there managed to subdue the last of the intruders. He turned to Maya and Jane, his expression grim but resolute. They couldn't stay. Grabbing the evidence and the USB drive, the 3 of them fled into the night, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they ran. As they reached the safety of Maya's car, the weight of what had just happened settled over them. Maya's hands shook as she started the engine, her mind racing with questions and fears. Jane sat beside her, her face pale but determined. In the back seat, the man clutched the evidence tightly, his eyes scanning the darkness for any signs of pursuit. The drive was silent, each of them lost in their thoughts. Maya's resolve hardened with each passing mile. She knew the fight ahead would be brutal, but she couldn't turn back now. Too much was at stake. Jane, though still conflicted, felt a spark of purpose igniting within her. The man, whose name they still didn't know, watched them both with a quiet respect. He had chosen his allies well. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were in this together, and the battle was only just beginning. The tension inside the car was unbearable. Maya gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white from the pressure. Beside her, Jane sat in silence, her eyes scanning the rearview mirror for any signs of pursuit. In the back seat, the man who had given them the evidence rested his head against the window, his face lined with exhaustion and quiet determination. None of them spoke, the events of the previous hour still too raw. The man leaned forward suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was low but insistent as he gave Maya directions to a safe house. Maya hesitated for a moment before nodding and changing course. Jane glanced at him, her expression skeptical. She didn't trust him, not entirely, but she had no choice but to go along for now. When they arrived at the safe house, a modest, nondescript building hidden in plain sight, they entered cautiously. The man locked the door behind them and led them to a small living room where he spread the documents and USB drive on the coffee table. Maya and Jane sat on the edge of the worn sofa, their tension palpable. The man began to explain. He laid out the connections between the precinct, the hospital, and a network of corrupt officials who had been using their positions to cover up crimes and enrich themselves. Every piece of evidence pointed to a web of deceit far larger than any of them had imagined. Maya's stomach churned as she realized how deep the corruption ran. Jane listened in stunned silence, the weight of the revelations pressing heavily on her. As the man spoke, Jane's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and frowned. It was a message from Tom Bradley, short and cryptic, demanding to know where she was. Her chest tightened. She knew he was suspicious, and his reach was long. Maya noticed Jane's unease and questioned her. Jane hesitated, then showed her the message. The implications were clear. Tom wasn't going to let this go. The man urged them to move quickly, to use the evidence before it could be buried. But Maya shook her head. She insisted they needed a plan, something airtight that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. Jane reluctantly agreed, though the urgency of their situation gnawed at her. They decided to split up. Maya would work to secure a contact in the media, someone trustworthy who could broadcast the story, while Jane would head to the precinct to monitor Tom's movements and gather more intel. The decision to separate felt dangerous, but it was necessary. Jane left first, her heart pounding as she drove toward the precinct. She rehearsed her story in her head, knowing she'd need to tread carefully around Tom. When she arrived, she found him waiting for her, his arms crossed and his expression dark. He asked her where she'd been, his tone sharp. Jane forced herself to stay calm, spinning a half-truth about investigating a lead. Tom's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press further, though his suspicion lingered like a shadow. Meanwhile, Maya contacted a journalist she trusted, a woman named Elaine Carter. Elaine had a reputation for exposing corruption and wasn't afraid to take risks. Maya explained the situation in clipped, urgent sentences, her voice trembling slightly as she laid out the stakes. Elaine listened intently, her own instincts kicking in. She agreed to meet Maya in person to review the evidence. The meeting with Elaine was tense. Maya handed over the USB drive, her fingers lingering on it for a moment before letting go. Elaine plugged it into her laptop and began scrolling through the files. Her expression shifted from curiosity to shock as she absorbed the information. She looked up at Maya, her voice steady but tinged with urgency, and promised to help. They agreed to coordinate a public release of the story, but Elaine warned that they needed to act quickly. The more time they took, the greater the risk of being silenced. Back at the precinct, Jane's efforts to stay under Tom's radar were failing. He watched her like a hawk, his questions growing more pointed. Jane's anxiety spiked as she realized he was piecing things together. She knew she had to get out before he confronted her outright. Feigning a phone call, she excused herself and left the building, her hands shaking as she started her car. Jane drove to meet Maya, her thoughts racing. She had barely made it out without arousing more suspicion, but she knew her cover wouldn't last. When she arrived at the safe house, Maya and Elaine were waiting, their expressions grim but determined. Jane quickly filled them in on her encounter with Tom, her voice trembling as she described his growing suspicion. Elaine outlined the next steps. They needed to release the story immediately, but they also needed to ensure their own safety. She suggested moving to a more secure location and reaching out to allies who could provide additional protection. Maya and Jane agreed, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on them. As they prepared to leave, Jane's phone buzzed again. Another message from Tom, more insistent this time. Her stomach twisted as she realized he was closing in. Maya noticed Jane's pale expression and asked what was wrong. Jane showed her the message, her hands trembling. Maya's eyes hardened, and she placed a reassuring hand on Jane's shoulder. They couldn't stop now. The three women left the safe house, their movements quick and deliberate. They drove in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts. The weight of their actions pressed down on them, but so did their resolve. They knew they were fighting for something bigger than themselves. When they reached the new location, Elaine began setting up her equipment, preparing to go live with the story. Maya and Jane stood by, their nerves raw but their determination unwavering. The room buzzed with tension as Elaine worked, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Finally, she turned to them, her expression serious but confident. It was time. As Elaine began the broadcast, Maya and Jane watched in silence. The weight of the moment was immense, the risk incalculable. But they knew they had no choice. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The room was tense with anticipation. Elaine Carter's live broadcast had begun, the damning evidence against Tom Bradley and the corruption network spilling into the public domain. Maya stood beside her, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, the weight of everything they'd fought for hanging in the air. Jane paced nearby, her phone clutched in her hand, knowing each second could bring news of their discovery. Elaine's voice was calm but commanding as she detailed the layers of deceit and betrayal within the precinct and the city. Names were named, connections drawn, and the USB drives files were displayed on the screen, undeniable proof of the systemic corruption. Maya felt a flicker of hope, but it was immediately tempered by the knowledge of the danger they still faced. Jane's phone buzzed, and she froze mid-step. The message was from an unknown number, but the content was clear. They had been tracked. Her breath caught as she showed it to Maya, who felt her stomach twist with dread. They barely had time to process the message when the sound of vehicles pulling up outside sent adrenaline coursing through their veins. Jane moved to the window, her jaw tightening as she confirmed multiple cars and armed figures emerging. They had come for them. Maya's heart pounded as she turned to Elaine, who was still broadcasting. She urged her to keep going, to ensure the story couldn't be silenced. Elaine nodded, her determination unshaken. Jane, meanwhile, checked her weapon, her mind racing through their limited options. They couldn't run, not now. They had to stand their ground. The first crash came as the front door was kicked open. Jane moved swiftly, positioning herself near the entryway, her weapon raised. Maya grabbed the folder of documents and backed toward the room's far corner, her eyes darting for an escape route. Elaine continued to speak into the camera, her voice steady even as the chaos unfolded behind her. The intruders entered with precision, their movements calculated. Jane called out warnings, her voice firm as she demanded they stand down. The lead figure ignored her, advancing with purpose. When he raised his weapon, Jane fired. The sound was deafening, the confrontation erupting into violence as more men surged inside. Maya pressed herself against the wall, clutching the folder tightly. She felt powerless, the weight of the moment threatening to overwhelm her. But then she caught sight of a side door leading to a narrow hallway. Without hesitation, she made a decision. She gestured to Elaine, who quickly grabbed her laptop and followed. Jane saw their movement and nodded, her focus shifting back to the intruders as she provided cover. Maya and Elaine moved quickly but carefully down the hallway, their breaths shallow and quick. The sound of gunfire echoed behind them, a constant reminder of the danger they were fleeing. They reached a side exit and hesitated, unsure if the outside was any safer. But there was no time to debate. Maya pushed the door open, and they slipped into the night. Back inside, Jane fought with a ferocity born of desperation. She knew she was outnumbered, but she also knew she had to buy Maya and Elaine as much time as possible. Each shot she fired was precise, each movement calculated. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one stood out: she couldn't let them win. Maya and Elaine found temporary refuge in an alley, their breaths ragged. Maya's hands trembled as she opened the folder, double-checking the contents. It was all still there. Elaine's laptop beeped, signaling that the broadcast was still live. They had managed to maintain the signal, even as everything around them fell apart. Maya felt a surge of relief but knew it was fleeting. They weren't safe yet. The sound of footsteps approached, and both women tensed. Jane appeared, her face streaked with sweat and her movements urgent. She had managed to escape, but her expression told them everything they needed to know. They had to keep moving. The intruders wouldn't stop until they had silenced them all. The trio made their way through the darkened streets, sticking to the shadows. Jane led the way, her weapon at the ready, while Maya and Elaine followed closely behind. Every sound, every movement set their nerves on edge. They were hunted, and the predators were relentless. Eventually, they found shelter in an abandoned building. Jane secured the perimeter while Maya and Elaine set up a makeshift workstation. Elaine's fingers flew across the keyboard, ensuring the broadcast continued uninterrupted. Maya sorted through the documents, her mind racing as she tried to determine their next move. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an hour. Their resolve was tested as the weight of their situation pressed down on them. But none of them wavered. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to back down now. As dawn approached, the first rays of light breaking through the darkness, they heard the sound of approaching sirens. Maya's heart leaped into her throat. Were the sirens a sign of rescue, or had their pursuers escalated their efforts? Jane moved to the window, her body tense as she watched the vehicles approach. When she saw the markings of the FBI, her tension eased slightly. They had succeeded. The broadcast had reached the right people. Agents poured out of the vehicles, securing the area and moving to extract the trio. Maya felt a rush of relief but knew it was tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The evidence was out, but the fight wasn't over. As they were escorted to safety, she met Jane's gaze. They shared a silent understanding. They had faced the worst, and they had survived. But the road ahead would still be treacherous. As they drove away, Maya glanced at the folder in her lap. It was more than just papers, it was the truth. And now, it was unstoppable.